everyone taking the time to join us here today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So Adam, do I have the screen advanced capabilities here?
You should. If your arrows on your keyboard don't work, try using your cursor on the left side of your screen.
Okay, so the first thing I want to kind of get into here with you guys is some of the results from the GFOA member survey, and what we found in our member survey is that a strong financial foundation is a perennial concern for GFOA members. In fact, when we asked GFOA members about what their top concerns are as finance officers, we find that 7 out of the top 10 concerns that people bring are related to maintaining a strong financial foundation. So that might be things like maintaining structural balance in the budget, having a solid financial reserve, things like this. So kind of just tells us here that this is an issue that is very top of mind for GFOA members. Now, the good news is there's been a lot of progress here. So we do our surveys about the sorts of financial practices local governments have implemented. And in one of our more recent surveys, we found that 90% of people have a rainy day reserve, 75% have a debt policy, and 55% forecast operating budget, at least, or operating position, rather, I should say, at least 3 to 5 years in the future. So that's very good. When we had surveyed about, for example, the forecasting a few years ago, I think close to like 10% of people that were doing it about 8 years ago specifically. So made that kind of comparison. Scott, did you have something you wanted to add here?
Yeah, I do, and thanks for having me here today. When I first saw this is something that immediately hit our radar in Kansas City, and why I'm happy to take part in this presentation today. As far as the 7 out of 10 category, we firmly fell into that category. As we go through this presentation, we'll be talking primarily Kansas City's experience with our progress in what we call our citywide business plan and long-term financial plan. That's linking our strategy to our finances. And all that had to do with exactly the types of issues we're talking about here, particularly our rainy day reserve. We'll talk about how our process has changed since we started implementing our new plan and how it relates back to the foundations. But throughout the last about 10 years or so, Kansas City's reserve increased from as low as 2% in 2009 to over 20% now today. So, again, we'll relate that back to how the foundations that Shane will present today is so important for all communities, but specifically how it impacted Kansas City and our progress.
Got it. Okay, so thank you for that, Scott. Now, just a real quick question, guys. Adam, Dan, I'm still getting a few questions from about intermittent sound issues. Do we have any word on that? And I also just saw another chat. Someone says sound is unreliable. All right. Well, Adam, if you could let me know what's going on there, or in the meantime, I guess we will just soldier forward.
Sorry about that, Shane. You're a little bit choppy to me, but Scott was totally clear. I'm working on the issue, and I'll get back to everyone in chat.
Yeah, Adam, you're breaking up quite a bit as well. So I think we've got an issue here.
All right, thanks. I'll work on it.
All right, guys. Well, we'll just have to continue forward best we can. So the problem here, though, is we've got, so kind of given what we just heard, I think it's great that GFOA members are making this progress, but the problem, of course, is not solved, or we wouldn't be on this webinar here today. We've got things like the pension problems, or the government's aging infrastructure, and then what I like to politely call intergovernmental uncertainty. So that would be things happening at the federal or state level that complicates our lives here as public finance people. So let me move on. So kind of the work that GFOA has done over the past couple of years is looking for, well, what is the kind of next level of GFOA guidance that can help us continue the good work we're already doing, but also solutions for the challenges that we're going to face in the future. So we researched a body of work that has won a Nobel Prize in economics called Common Pool Resource Theory. And this work is all about how to have sustainable decision-making and good decision-making for shared resources. And if you think about it, a public budget, for example, is a shared resource shared by all different members of the community. So, example, all the different citizens and everyone like that, different stakeholders are essentially owners of the public budget. So this is a shared resource. And in this economic body of research, there's a little economic parable that I think describes this problem very well, and it's called The Tragedy of the Commons. And how this parable goes is you've got a grazing area that's surrounded by all of the farmers who own it collectively. And if they all own it collectively, they have the incentive to get as much as possible from it. So send all your animals onto the grazing area as much as possible, because if you don't, the other guy is sending their animal onto the grazing area, and they're grazing, getting fat and happy, while your animal is sitting at home. So everyone does this, sends their animals onto the grazing area as much as possible, and you get the result like this. And it's called the Tragedy of the Commons because the commons is eventually grazed down and depleted over a period of time because everyone's following this behavior where they're trying to get as much as possible from this shared resource. Now, our premise is the local government budget, as I mentioned, is much the same, where you've got the local government budget essentially shared by different community groups, departments. They're all shared owners in this budget, and they have the same incentive as the farmers, which is you get yours, because if you don't, the next guy will, and over time you end up with the tragedy of the local government budget. So luckily, this body of economic research tells us, suggests some solutions, not just suggests, but it proved out solutions to how to solve the common resource problem. So GFOA took those solutions and translated them to public finance and proved them out using a number of case studies over a 2-year period, 25 some odd case studies, in fact. So in the presentation here today, what we're going to be doing with you is sharing some of the insights that we gained from this research. And then one might ask, though, well, why this framework anyway? So big picture, backing up a minute, is this particular framework interesting and useful? Number one is it makes finances everyone's business. So if you think about the farmer example, you just can't have one individual saying, hey guys, we should conserve this resource. You have to have everyone involved in the decision to have a strong financial foundation, and when everyone's involved in it, it's going to be more likely to happen. So the same situation, again, applies to, I think, all shared resource problems. It goes beyond the numbers as well. So as we get into this, we'll kind of see about how this is about the root cause of how financial decisions are made. In other words, something like the numbers that show up in an accounting record are kind of backwards looking, right? It's like what happened last year. Certainly valuable, but if we're thinking about how do we have a financially strong local government, we need to think about, well, what's going to cause that to happen in the future? And this particular framework gets at those, because it's getting at the underlying behaviors that make that happen, which leads to our third bullet, is that the idea here is that a lot of the kind of thinking and just kind of how like business administration, public administration, these fields are based on an underlying assumption that people are rational actors. That's not news to anybody that people are not rational, but really if you think about it, it's a lot of times in economics and other sorts of fields that all the work that, all the kind of management thinking that our fields are really looking towards are based on the assumption that people are rational. The work in this research doesn't assume that. And then lastly, as it works, we mentioned we did a bunch of case studies to prove this out. We'll be seeing some examples from that. And of course, this is a Nobel Prize winning body of work. So it's a pretty good evidence base to go by. So let's go on into what does this framework include exactly. So The framework includes 6 leadership strategies and 8 institutional design principles. And the point of these leadership strategies, or the idea here, is that people can't be ordered to behave in a sustainable way. So in other words, you need to motivate them, where that motivation comes from it's more like internally generated desire from people. So that might be in pride, loyalty, enthusiasm. In other words, these sort of forces that they're going to want to make the organization sustainable. I think Dwight Eisenhower said it best, is the kind of best way of leadership was to get people to do something because they want to do it. So in other words, you can't just order them to do it, they have to be motivated to want to do it. The other part of this framework is these 8 institutional design principles, and these are essentially the rules of the game. So in other words, how are you going to design your system so that the system helps point people towards and direct people towards a financially solid future for the organization. However, in this webinar, we're not going to try to get through 14 leadership strategies and 8 institutional design principles in 2 hours. Instead, we have summarized these down a bit into 5 pillars. So we've got these 5 pillars that constitute the Financial Foundations framework. So you've got your pillars displayed on the slide. We've got number 1, establish a long-term vision. 2, build trust and open communication. 3 is use collective decision-making. 4 is create clear rules. And then 5 is treat people fairly. So we're going to go ahead and look at these 5 pillars as the organizing principle for today's webinar. So let's get into pillar number 1, which is establish a long-term vision. So first, a little bit of the research as to where this comes from. I mentioned the Nobel Prize-winning body of work, and as such, there's a pretty good body of evidence that underlies a lot of this. So I want to share with you some of the evidence that this work uses to come up with these solutions we're going to talk here about today. So the first thing here, this is called the public goods game. It's a sort of experiment that's used to see how people behave in response to different sort of motivations. And in this particular game, you've got a number of folks who are given amount of money by the experimenter. And the people who are given this money, and this is represented by the folks on the left-hand side, have the option to contribute some of that money to a common pool. And you might think about that common pool being like a local government, for example. So people contribute taxes or fees to the local government. And the experimenter is representing the common pool, then multiplies that contribution and divides it back out. And you might think of that multiple as people's tax dollars being transformed into public services that they value. So, for example, if I value fire protection, the money that I pay to my local government for that fire protection, say it's like just for instance $100 in taxes, presumably the value of fire protection is worth more than $100 to me, and that is why my contribution to the local government is I see that as a good thing, right? And so this experiment, the money is multiplied and then distributed back out evenly, and you might think about that like a lot of public services like fire protection. Everyone derives a more or less equal benefit from fire protection. They don't check to see how much you paid in taxes before they decide to come out to your house to put out a fire. So it's distributed back out evenly. Everyone's happy because really at the end of the day, everyone's getting more back than they put into it. So for example, this guy up here in the upper left corner gave $1, the person in the middle gave $2, and the person here gave $3. That is a total of $6. If you multiplied that times 3, you get 18, and then if you divide that back out evenly amongst everybody, everyone's getting $6, which is more than they gave at the beginning, so everyone's happy, right? So now the problem is, though, what if there's no multiplier, right? So people contribute the money, but it's then divided out evenly. So if you've got 1, 2, and 3 contributed, you're down to 6 again. That means everyone gets 2. That means the guy who gave 1 works out for him, but for the other people, not so much. One person just breaks even, and the other person actually loses money on this. And so you can imagine how this would apply to a local government situation where folks don't feel they're getting value for the tax money that they're contributing. They're going to be unhappy with the system, And in these experiments, what it shows is the people who contribute the money to the common pool, more money end up reducing their contribution or dropping out altogether. And that could be, for example, the same thing like with taxpayer disaffection with local government or what have you. So the implication here for us is we need to think about, well, how do we create a sense of value in the people, and that create a sense of value so that people feel local government is working for them. And I'm going to share with you one of our case examples, San Bernardino County, California, and how they did it, and how establishing a really clear vision was a key part of showing people that San Bernardino was a valuable contributor to their community. So kind of the background here is that San Bernardino is the largest county by land area in the continental United States. It is about the size of Massachusetts by land area. Got very diverse geography, so we've got deserts, mountains, even traffic jams, so all sorts of things happening. It's actually just a little bit east of LA, so you can imagine there's a lot of urbanization there, as well as some of these more, we'll say, sparse natural settings. And then with being such a big county, it's also got millions of people, so you can imagine that's got very diverse stakeholders as well. It also had a big budget deficit. So in 2009, it had in fact an $80 million deficit that they had rolled into next year, even while salary and benefit increases were being approved. So that would be the kind of very definition of kicking the can down the road. So needless to say, things were not going in a really positive direction for San Bernardino County finances there. So one of the things they decided to do was to create a county vision and strategic plan. And so the idea being is, well, if we're going to turn things around, we have to have a vision for the future that we're going to move towards. And so what I think was really interesting about their plan and distinctive is it wasn't just a plan for the county government, but they decided to make it a plan for the entire community. So it wasn't the San Bernardino County Strategic Plan, it was kind of just the San Bernardino Community Strategic Plan. And the goal of it was to highlight shared interests and why the county should be financially sustainable. And so they looked at a number of different areas. For example, they looked at child literacy was one of the issues that were addressed in this plan. So the county did not include the school district in their planning and as part of its auspices, but they include the school district in the planning process. So meaning the school district completely separate entity, but the county realized that, hey, you know what? Literacy of children is very important, and education is very important to people in San Bernardino. So if we had a community strategic plan that didn't include education, it would be DOA, right? No one would think it's useful because people think education is important. So if we have a plan for the community, it needs to include education. Let's get the school district to be a part of our planning process and work together to figure out how we can advance these goals. And one real good example of that is the idea of wraparound services in school districts. So the idea being is that if kids don't come to school ready to learn because they're hungry, have concerns about where they're going to sleep at night, things like this, it's going to be very hard for them to reach their educational goals at school. And school districts aren't social service agencies, but it turns out the county is. The county does a lot of that sort of work. So the idea is, could the school district and the county then work together to achieve the educational goals for children, because they can both bring something to the table, and in fact they can. So the school district was one of the key participants in this planning process. We have on the slide here another example was water resources. So I mentioned earlier that San Bernardino has a lot of desert in it, so therefore water, very important. And there was a lot of different agencies in San Bernardino that were responsible for the water resources, and they actually had no idea whether there was enough water in San Bernardino County to sustain the population because they'd never worked together before. So they all had the opportunity to come together and cooperate under the auspices of this community plan. And the good news is they found out that there was, in fact, enough water in San Bernardino for the population. So that was good news. The thing to work on was that the water wasn't necessarily where it needed to be to serve the population centers. So the plan also created the conditions and the possibility for these organizations to work together to figure out how to get the water to where it needs to be, and they started to work on that after they had figured out what the inventory of water resources was. So kind of the point being here, or the real takeaway, is that having this strategic vision for the entire community help people see why San Bernardino is valuable and want to contribute to its upkeep. So it kind of helped them see, oh, this is the multiplier that makes me want to contribute to this little government and see it be financially healthy. So we have a few poll questions here, and as part of this webinar. So our question here is, which of the following describes the state of strategic planning in your community? We've got 4 choices. You can go ahead and pick one, and your options there on your screen will show up. So go ahead and select which option best applies to you. And well, why don't we move forward, and hopefully, there we go. All right. In most cases, we have good, question C, we have good integration with the plan and budget, but participation is mostly limited people. The kind of the little experiment that describes the importance of trust and open communication is the prisoner's dilemma. Some of you may have heard of this. This is a really, we'll say, I think, experimental game that can be a helpful illustration to some of the problems that we face in a common resource dilemma. So, in this, you've got game prisoners and their members of the criminal gang captured by, so they're both essentially prisoner, in other words, testify for the problem here is that if one prisoner decides does or charge. So each prisoner presented you get to all right, guys, sorry about that. I understand we're having more audio problems, so apologize for that. Okay, I'll start again on this slide. So the slide is an illustration of the common that local government is called the prisoner's dilemma. How this works is you've got 2 prisoners and they've been members of criminal gang by police, and they're 2 respective also separate, and the prisoner have to not offer evidence to the colleague, fellow prisoner, or they get evidence is that if you're prisoner 2 and the other guy because it says, therefore, we see that in cell B, the left-hand corner. Similar outcome for prisoner 1. Go 3. It's either in that will work out for you if you get to the other to jail. However, they both offer them for proper why I don't have enough to really have any significant. So the here that the prison would be same class incentive to deliver to individually testify against other prisoners. Second slide. We have a little audio problem, so hopefully this is. Apologize. Continual problems, but hopefully that got across with how this relates to local and that I'm my best to be mean, but the other, I could mean, or I could my butt some extra padding. Similar situation, right, where if everyone that it works out for the entire if everyone says, well, I'm a little padding, it works out for them individually. The organization for the long term doesn't work out. So now get the audio. So go example with trust. We're going to jump into real example. In San Bernardino County, and so part of their efforts to be more financially sustainable, the sheriff had to be a part of the solution. So kind of going back to our prisoner's dilemma case, the sheriff has to contribute and also kind of be a part of a team to reach a kind of solid financial future. So one of the things that they wanted to do in San Bernardino is reduce the amount of padding in the. In other words, if departments are worried about a bad thing happening, they're going to pad their budget. And just a little thought experiment, let's imagine we've got 10 departments in a local government. Each one of them believes that they have a 10% chance of a bad thing happening in that department in the amount of $1 million. So 10% chance of incurring $1 million of unexpected costs. Every department believes this, so they all put aside $1 million. However, it's a 10% chance, so on average across 10 departments, you're going to need $1 million per year. They've put aside 10, that's $9 million extra dollars in padding. So that's the fundamental problem that we face in this particular system. So San Bernardino's thought was, well, if we can have a centralized pool of contingency that everyone draws from, we don't need to have everyone have their own individual contingency, we could save a lot of money potentially. However, to do this, departments need to trust that if something bad happens, that the central contingency or the central administration will have their back. So the CEO of San Bernardino County decided to talk with the sheriff and said, hey, sheriff, if you contribute to this contingency, you just trust me, I've got your back if bad happens. So the sheriff goes with it. Bad thing happens, which in this case was a big month in San Bernardino County. Los Angeles police officer. CEO gets a call from the sheriff and says, CEO, I've got this manhunt going. I'm spending a ton of money to find this guy. I'm going to blow my budget. What do I do? CEO says, you don't worry about it. You let me worry about the money. You worry about catching this guy. You go ahead and do what you need to do to ensure public. So other departments could be very important as contributors to this. So with that, or by that I mean they've witnessed this and seen that trust can be built and that the Central Budget Office has their back. So Scott, did you want to add something at this point?
Sure, yeah. This has been, this issue particularly of regular communication with departments, collaboration has really been a work in progress for our office over the last number of years. I'm sure many people out there experience something similar. I mentioned as far as planning for those contingencies, those emergencies, that's exactly the message that we try to send to our departments now. We'll worry about that when things come up. We always remind people, essentially, hey, when have we not funded something that's been an emergency? We'll be there. You do your thing. And like just as Shane said, let us worry about the money. We also have developed over the last couple of years what we call essentially an innovation fund, where departments can vie for specific programs or projects outside their norm, so that they don't feel like they're continually boxed into their existing departmental budgets and like you say, and end up padding to fund those items that otherwise would not be funded. So we try to increase the collaboration that way. And we just hold in our office regular meetings with our departments and ongoing communication, so there are fewer surprises. We emphasize that in our case, the budget season should not be the first time that we talk about or we hear about a new program, so we try to keep those communications ongoing so that as we enter the world of finance as a team, as a city, that we're all on the same page knowing what's to come, and it really, again, benefits the whole and keeps the surprises at a minimum. We try to have a little fun with it as well. During our annual executive retreats, our office likes to hold what we call an airing of the grievances. Anyone who's ever watched Seinfeld probably is familiar with the Festivus celebration, and airing of the grievance is one of them. It's a way for departments to give a lighthearted feedback to us as far as concerns what we can do better. And we do it in a lighthearted way, but the suggestions we get are real, and we take them back and try to incorporate them, respond to them. But again, it's just a fun, jocular way for us to gain greater cooperation, greater communication, just overall teamwork between our operating departments and ourselves, and it really has contributed over the last number of years a better way to both manage operations and the finance at the same time. So, I just can't stress enough how we've got your back, how important this slide and this particular aspect of the foundations is to the overall whole. Thank you.
All right. Scott, I appreciate that. All right, well, and then if folks are interested in learning more on this, GFOA has a white paper, Transparency and Means to Improving Citizen Trust and Government. So that was a topic you want to learn more about. Very easy, free download for you right there. All right, we're going to move on to decision making. So the idea is that you need to kind of make decisions to better, or decisions are going to be better together, right? Or made better if they're made together, I should say. So you have, just taking our farmer example, if all the farmers decide collectively about how to use the grazing area to the best effect, it's going to be more that decision is going to hold resources. So a little quote here we have from case study research where it says the standard process called for our city manager to work behind closed doors until she proposed the budget to the elected body, which then held public hearings. Insiders could object to proposed cuts, and new cuts were substituted. Too late for opposition to gather or be effective. That favors insiders and leads to conflict, pitting individuals against each other and against their own elected representatives. So, not a good situation. Not one that is about collective decision making. So let's see, we'll examine this a little further. So the first thing we might want to talk about is how citizens contribute to good decisions. So perhaps not all GFOA members are contributed to having citizens involved in the budget process, or not all GFOA members are convinced, I should say, that having citizens involved in the budget process is necessarily a good thing. So we'll talk a little bit about that first. So why might it be good to have citizens contribute to the budget process? So number one, decision. So just to give you an example, City of Hampton, Virginia was facing a large budget deficit, and they had done a little analysis at the staff level to look at libraries, and they found out that the libraries were being used a lot less than they had been in the past. And so they said, less, this is showing up to reduce the hours for branch libraries. So they had a hearing with the public to discuss the different cutting options, and they went in the library, but including other things, everything. Cutting libraries, and it's not library pack the room or something, because a lot of yeah, sure, I don't go to the library, but I would like to see the library being available for people like citizens, you know, maybe to go after school, stuff like this. So it was kind of a value, right? It wasn't an efficiency question. I use the library for a week to go to. It was more like I value being able to communicate with citizens and whoever else that need to use that lead there about being unique to discuss citizens have to be. And lastly, is the decision-making process down, and we need to good thing for the process. Sometimes value conflicts, ironing these things out, will make implementation a lot. You can imagine taking a process kind of just goes through or kind of through, over, or around concern when it comes to values they hold. They're probably not cooperating implementation. Will probably be very rough. However, if you take the time to slow the process down, get people involved and surround the decision, then the implementation further in your total time from beginning to end of the project will actually take the time at the beginning consensus to make it up on the back. So we've got a model of the public engagement process. So I'm going to do a little model here, and then provide some of the concepts on the following slide. First, we've got the engagement. So we have compelling because they're busy. They have to give up their family or time at work to be able to participate in this, and so that find a compelling public purpose, that would be better, which then leads into convincing people. So if there's a purpose, what else can you do to convince them to be part of it? So can you have this at a location that's easy for them to access? You can do it at convenient things like this. Then we move into provide the meeting structure in a way that put together in a way that patient talking about shared show work. So we are having what line had your slide talking about the can see if the entire see if that makes sense.
Sorry, having some problems on my end too with the audio, but I think what I'll do here is go ahead and talk about Kansas City's process as a whole. This is what we call our circle of life, and this is a process that we've changed over the last number of years. You know, prior to 2013, I think we had a overall budget and finance process that was probably similar to how most traditional processes work, both internally and with the public process as well. We think this crosses several of the foundations throughout our process, so I'll just go through what we do really quick. Again, we started this about 6 years ago. It's a continued work in progress, but we're getting better at it every year, and it really integrates the public part into this as well. So we have in Kansas City, again, like I mentioned before, not just a budget season per se, but what is truly a year-round process. We start each year in our cycle by updating first our strategic plan, so essentially the city's goals and objectives, and the strategies and actions to carry out those goals and objectives throughout the year. And this is done collectively with our city council and with our senior management. And this is something that since we've incorporated this, we are now required to do by charter, to go back and update our plan, have it adopted each year by the city council with revisions, check off what's completed, make new actions, et cetera. So we start that before we've even touched one number in the budget process. We start at the high level with the strategy, and that's a collective process throughout the city. After we've done that, we integrate our long-term financial plan into our strategic plan. So we have a 5-year model that must also be updated annually. And we combine those two forces so that the strategy is linked with the finances. And at that point, we present that to our residents, to the public, and they give an opportunity to comment and to weigh in to actually craft the city's strategy and long-term financial plan before it gets to the city council, before we even start the budget process. And the idea here is that, as many of you can probably appreciate, it's really hard within the context of a 1-year budget to fundamentally change the policy direction or financial direction of a community. It really is a long-term process. That's why we have emphasized both to within the city government itself and to the residents at large, the benefit of commenting, weighing in, participating on the front end of the process, and because that's where the policy decisions are really made. So we collect all that, we adopt our citywide business plan, and only at that point do we actually begin the budget process itself, which we call simply a 1-year snapshot of our 5-year plan. Again, the emphasis is really on the front end, the policy part, rather than the back end, which is the budget and the trends analysis. It has really worked over the years to bring in more community ownership of the process, again, both internally and externally. And we engage all of our stakeholders throughout the process, not just during the budget season. It's really helped to increase our credibility and I think our resource allocation as well by having this cohesive piece throughout the process. And Shane, if you can switch to the next slide, I think. Here we go. This is a brief encapsulation of how we conduct some of our resident feedback, and we could probably hold a whole nother presentation on resident engagement, and I guess we have, but One of the primary things we do, again, on the front end of the process to bring in the community and get that ownership up front is to hold what we call resident work sessions. And at these work sessions, we try to mimic the planning and budget process in just a couple of hours. So essentially, we're taking them through the circle of life that we do on a year-round basis in just a couple hours. So we start with usually focus groups. We start them at the high level, just like we do in the city. So we ask them about their visions for the city, their long-term plans. Are we allocating resources effectively? Are we even implementing the right strategies to achieve the goals that have been adopted by the city? So we start at the high level. Then we ask them to prioritize our strategies. Of these strategies we have identified in our plan to achieve our goals, both operationally and financially, where should we put the most effort? Again, this is the exact same process we do internally. And finally, at the end, we wrap up with taking them through a budget exercise to tie it all together. So again, the idea is to not only engage the community on the front end, but to take them through the process so they understand both the process and the challenges of thinking holistically, developing a budget, making those decisions. But again, after we've done that, we've found almost universally residents have both a greater appreciation and a greater understanding for what we do. We are able to tie back what results at the end of our process in our budget to decisions and feedback given at these sessions, so they don't feel like they're wasting their time. We're not just checking the box with these resident work sessions, but really do matter. So there have been years where we found that neighborhood investment was a top priority. So we actually relay back what changes we made to the budget and to the 5-year plan to specifically address neighborhoods. We've had similar items where infrastructure was a top priority. So keeping them involved throughout the process, start to finish, has really helped. We get more participation every year. Like I said before, it's always a work in progress, but keeping that long-term, year-round approach has really improved our engagement and again, really improved our credibility in the community through this process.
Are you able to hear me?
I heard you, Shane.
Hello? Oh. Scott, are you able to hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. Let's see. So, Scott, just one more sound check here. Are we good? Okay. All right. So I've got a new audio connection and all that. So we're going to try it to go through. So thank you, Scott, for that little audible. And I will talk about the walking through our little diagram here to show you how some of the stuff was applied in the City of Hampton. So, City of Hampton, number one, set a clear purpose for the engagement. So, let me just a quick revisit here to help reorient people. We've got A, decide the purpose of public engagement. Why are we doing this? B, convince people to engage, so make it easy for them, stuff like this. What kind of convince them to give up their time and energy to be able to work on this. C is provide the engagement medium, so what does the meeting format look like? How do they get engaged? And how is that supported by a shared set of facts, especially it's I think very relevant in the year 2019. And then is show opportunities for future engagement. The idea being is if that the engagement goes well, people are going to be more favorably disposed to participate again. And that kind of also brings in the idea of having an outcome produced and communicated that's positive to people, and that's going to create a positive expectation that, hey, that was great. You know, I went to this meeting. I feel like we convinced them, accomplished some things. I'd like to be part of that again. So let's see how that worked in the City of Hampton. So number one is set a clear purpose. So in the City of Hampton, they needed to make some trade-offs between service levels, and they wanted to know what the residents were willing to pay for. And the kind of metaphor they used was Hampton was at a crossroads. So that's a pretty good purpose, right? Like, hey guys, we're at a crossroads. We have to decide, what we want to do as a community, right? Are we going to raise your taxes? Are we going to cut services? These are things that could get people interested. And as far as convincing goes, they kind of then took that a step further and developed it into 3 distinct choices they were asking people to make about the different services in Hampton. So they could invest, meaning have more of a service. They could preserve the service they already had, or they could divest of that service. So the idea being is, we don't like paying taxes. We're happy to cut the service. Fine, that was an option. So they were going to go through that and think about those 3 things for the different services that Hampton offered. So moving on then, the things is, number one is they first did a study of the surrounding communities and compared Hampton's tax rates to other communities, and they found that Hampton's tax rates were actually a bit lower than many of the surrounding communities, but yet people thought they were paying a lot of taxes, so why might that be? So what they discovered is that many folks were paying things like their mortgage, their taxes, mortgage interest, of course, mortgage insurance, all these things on a single monthly bill, and weren't really differentiating between what was taxes and how much was these other costs. And so some of these other costs go up and change, so people just assumed it was their tax bill going up. So it turns out that, it had the taxes been the same. It's things like if I had an ARM loan that reset at a certain point, for example, that would cause my monthly bill to go up. And the second point there is to make the experience interesting. So in Hampton's case, what they did is going back to that invest, preserve, divest choice. They would put a service up on a big screen, like projected up on the screen, and then they give everyone clickers in the room, or they could use an app on their phone to vote. And I'm sure you've all probably participated in this sort of online voting system. In fact, you've done so in this webinar already, where they would ask people, hey, well, here's the library service, or here's the police patrol, or whatever else, and they would ask people to, do we want to invest, preserve, or divest of each individual service? And what's kind of interesting about that is folks would learn a bit more about the preferences of their fellow citizens in this way, perhaps. A very firm opinion that, like, service animal control was a service that Hampton didn't need, and they should get rid of that. And they say, well, of course, everyone agrees control. I think that me. That maybe there's a lot of people animal controls. So learn represent the everybody in this thing. Kind of what this gets to in that here, that our research is really showing the best in the range as the official to or raise your citizens then have to guard against, kind of stop from happening, so it becomes the public versus the officials. However, if you get everyone involved in making trade-offs and thinking together, what is the best use of resources, and how do we keep our taxes at a level where we want them to be, it's going to be successful. All right, let's move on to the next slide here. And a little bit about technology use is that there's a number of pros and cons. Using technology is number one in terms of pros go. Low friction, so meaning there's you can participate from anywhere. Maybe this webinar is proving otherwise. Usually there's low friction in technology when it works properly anyhow. It can provide access to unique sources of data, and the idea here is that, for example, you might be able to ask every individual citizen, like they did in Hampton, what they think with the little clickers. And, maybe if you're using an online forum, like a social media type of thing, you could have maybe a chance to meet people from across the community that you might not otherwise meet. So these are all good. In terms of cons, there's a few things happening. There's less nuance, no body language. So in order to build trust, face-to-face contact is often pretty in a public meeting, or in a technology environment, I should say. Reduced empathy. So there's some research that shows online forums tend to result in low empathy displayed to other people, and maybe just visit an online comment section for any paper ever, and you'll probably see that there's empathy's in short supply there, but I think you can apply more beyond just that, and it's been proven to do so. So you lose that opportunity to build empathy, which is important if you're talking about trade-offs, right? If I want to cut library service or whatever else, it's important to understand who's going to be impacted by that. And then lastly, poor preparation for real-life decision-making. The idea being is that budget decisions are complicated and lots of things to balance, and technology can be a little oversimplifying. So, for example, in our Hampton case, it's great that people are doing the trade-offs of invest, divest, preserve, but, that's maybe a little bit of an oversimplification of how this works. It still produces value for Hampton, but is it going to be like, the optimal kind of view into, or the best experience of how these decisions a real life budget process? Maybe not. But again, there's pros and cons balanced against each other. And I think the real takeaway from this slide and Hampton's example shows is that using these two things together as complements is key, and they're not really, one's not a substitute for the other. Using them both can be pretty great. So let's move on there. So I think, and this is the last point we want to make about public engagement is back to our friends at San Bernardino County, San Bernardino County took this all a step further by doing what's called a networked organization. So I mentioned earlier that in San Bernardino, the part of the process in San Bernardino, that's called a networked approach, right? It's not just county, it's the school working together, and water weren't part of the county government, all coming together to decide about how San Bernardino would manage its water resource. And there are many different examples of this in San Bernardino. They had both public, private, and nonprofit organizations involved in their strategic planning process, so getting a lot of different input here. So just to give you some examples of how this works in San Bernardino, they clarified a goal for their network. So let's just take the example of the school district and the education. So let's just say their goal was to increase literacy for third graders. So that's often considered an important educational goal, because the idea being is that up to third grade, kids are learning to read. After third grade, they're reading to learn. So if they don't know how to read by third grade, they're not going to be able to learn as well. So that was their goal, right? So we've clarified a goal. They're curating the membership of this network. So we got to get the school district involved clearly. Maybe there's some nonprofits that can help with getting kids ready to learn with those wraparound services. They connected people. So you have to find a way to connect people together. So in San Bernardino, what they did is form these things called element groups. So they had a group of public, private, and nonprofit entities that were interested in helping third graders to read, and getting them all in one room and connected is a pretty valuable service that the county provided. So it curated the people and then gave them the forum for those people to then work together. Also, they cultivated this network mindset, so that was a little bit something the county had to do for itself. Number one, get kind of wrap its mind around the idea at these meetings. So in other words, just sort of facilitating the whole process. And what was kind of a cool outcome of this, just to give you an example of how this worked, is they were getting people excited and engaged and, hey, let's come together and work on third grade literacy. And they found some support from many of the organizations that you might expect, but also support from a lot that you wouldn't expect. So one of the things they wanted to do as a community, for example, to promote third grade literacy was to have a Read to Your Kids program, like, kind of emphases on this is Read to Your Kids Month, stuff like this. And they actually had the local minor league baseball team jump on board. Hey, that's a pretty cool goal. We'd like to have promotions at our ballpark that say when you come to the game, we're giving books away or whatever else, things like this to kind of promote this idea of reading to your kids. So kind of getting all these different organizations involved brings in support from a lot of different areas and can help an organization reach the goal that much better. And I think, one important consideration, because this is the Government Finance Officers Association after all, is when it comes to the budget, this is a resource multiplier, because really giving third grade literacy is not something that San Bernardino County is going to be able to do, even if it didn't have those financial problems that we described earlier. So even in the best financial conditions, San Bernardino is not going to have enough money to achieve all these goals. So having this network brings a whole bunch of extra resources into allows the county to be a lot more effective because the network has become this kind of force multiplier, resource multiplier, if you will. And then the last point here is catalyzing the network into action. So in San Bernardino's case, they had a new CEO to lead the county out of this financial distress that it was facing and into this vision for a new and improved county. It doesn't necessarily have to be new officials, but the point being is having some kind of catalyzing event or something to spark the network into action is very powerful potentially. All right, so Scott had already presented this, and thank you again, Scott, for audible. All right, guys, so now we have a discussion question. We want to know what you feel is your biggest impediment to more effective citizen engagement. So we've got the multiple choice poll again. Let us know. You got to mute. All right, so hopefully everyone's had enough time to go ahead and enter their preferences there. We're going to go ahead and move on. And we see, so we've got lack of staff time is the big winner, so that's good. And we got a few people that are very good at it, so excellent. 2 folks that are doing very well, so pretty cool. All right, so why don't we move on? So pillar 4 is create clear rules. And what this one is all about is the idea that you need some kind of rules of the game, right? And financial policy is a very good starting point for when you're deciding the rules of the game. Financial policies do a lot of things for you. As number 1, there are guidelines for operational strategic decision making. They identify these acceptable or unacceptable courses of action, and they provide a standard to judge performance. So why don't we just kind of go ahead and see what some policies look like and get a little more specific here. So a few types of key policies that you might want to think about. You may have many of these already, so great. If you find some opportunities here or policies you don't have, that could be an opportunity for you. So number 1 is the general fund reserve, so the target amount of reserves, so how much reserves do you want to maintain, and then the conditions for using the reserve, so what are the kind of rules or the boundaries, if you will, that define how much reserves you want to have. So you've got there kind of, if you think about it, 2 important rules or boundaries, right? So what is the type of reserves you want to have? That's a boundary. How much, and then under what condition and when is another type of boundary. Number 2 is we've got the revenue. So we've got the use of one-time revenue. So if we get a revenue that we don't expect to get again in the future, how can that revenue be used, right? So that's another kind of decision rule or boundary on the use of that type of revenue. Similar idea could be applied to unpredictable or volatile revenue. So if you've got, like, say, sales tax or a big part of your local government's revenue base, one might have some policies about, well, we have peak sales tax, like we just got like the most sales tax revenue ever in our history. How likely is it next year that you're going to get, well, now we've got even more sales tax, so we've got like now the new record for sales tax happen the following year. Probably not in many cases, right? It will probably go back down a little bit. because maybe there was some extraordinary circumstance that led to you getting that extra revenue for your record-beating sales tax. So you might have a policy that says, we're not going to use these extraordinary revenues for ongoing services. We're going to be a little more cautious in how those get used. And then we've got below that covering costs with user fees. So the idea being that having a policy that describes your intent to cover the costs of certain types of services with user fees. Certainly you may have a little more description in your policy about which types of services you want to cover more fully versus those you don't. So for instance, utilities, typically 100%. Maybe building permits would be another thing where it's 100%. But, maybe a recreation program for at-risk youth, less than 100% would be desirable. But the point being is having a clear agreement among people on what the role of user fees is and what sort of cost recovery you're going to go for provides a very good boundary. And then lastly on the slide, we have budgeting and financial planning. So we might think about a structurally balanced budget. So in other words, in most states and provinces, there is a rule that says sources have to equal uses for local government. However, you could sell off City Hall and use that money to pay your police officers, and that would be considered a balanced budget by the definition that the state provides. However, I think we all know on this call that that would probably not be a very good long-term plan. So having a local definition of a balanced budget, perhaps one where ongoing revenues have to equal ongoing expenditures and one-time revenues equal one-time expenditures, could be a better kind of boundary or rule to live by. And finally, we have long-term planning, so maybe thinking about what is the long-term, the time horizon for planning in your local government. So is it 3 years? Is it 5 years? That's another sort of boundary we might look at. All right, moving on to a couple more key policies is capital planning, so developing a long-term capital improvement plan. So similar concept as how many years out in the future are we going to look. But also beyond that is accounting for operating budget impact, so making sure when we're talking about a capital investment that we're also considering the staffing that might be necessary to operate this new capital asset, as well as the ongoing maintenance costs, which gets into some of the idea behind that third little sub-bullet there. And then finally, debt. So we might talk about acceptable uses of debt. So the most obvious would be not using debt to pay for operating expenditures, but maybe there's also a limit on the amount of debt. That can be pretty important. So for instance, when I worked in local government in the state of Illinois, we had a rule by the state that had described the maximum amount of debt that our city could carry. However, if we ever got anywhere close to the state-imposed limit, we'd be in big trouble because that limit from the state was really big because it had to be applicable to every municipality in Illinois, and there's a lot of them. So it really was a one-size-doesn't-really-fit-all sort of thing because the size was so big that it was a meaningless number. So we had to come up with our own locally applied debt limit that made sense for our community. And then finally, it's maturity guidelines. So you might think about if you're going to have, like, say, maximum maturities or maybe something about repayment schedules and, when balloon repayments or payments that are weighted towards the back might be appropriate and when they might not. And Scott, I believe you wanted to say something as part of this slide.
Sure. Just a quick note on Kansas City's experience with developing and amending our financial policies. We got, really a late start. It was, just before we started, the process I described before, our circle of life, but we didn't get into really adopting our financial policies, at least to GFOA best practice standards, until 2011. But since that time, we've adopted all these on the screen and a couple more based on the templates that the GFOA provides. And since then, we've adopted, we've revised them, and we've updated several. And one in particular, now that we've achieved our fund balance goal in the last couple of years, I think largely due to our financial planning, we're looking to update that one as well. So just to note that, at least for us, developing and adopting financial policies is not a one-and-done scenario. We find that we're continually revising, reviewing, and amending our financial policies based on new conditions on the ground. But again, just one key piece that has really helped improve our financial resiliency just in the last few years by having these policies in place and continuing to emphasize them internally and with our council as well.
All right, very good. Thank you, Scott. All right, let's move on. Or forward would be a better idea than backwards. Let's see. All right, good. All right, well, so we just had a little, or we do another poll here, I should say. We've got actually 2 questions in a row for you. So of the policies we just described, how many do you have in place? And just to remind you of them, we had the general fund reserve, we had revenues, we had debt, we had capital planning. All right, so hopefully everyone has a chance to go ahead and give their input to that one. So we've got, okay, well, a number of folks have all of them, so that's pretty great. And then we've got a number of folks also who are working on it. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. So of the policies we just described, what is the most important for you to add, improve? So we've got a few options there for you, and you can pick one of those. All right. Everyone had a chance to pop in their answer. We'll move forward. All right, interesting. So capital planning seems to be the winner there, but all pretty close. So that's great. All right, moving on. 2. So we had just talked about the ideas of financial policies, and the kind of concept there is it's really good fences make good neighbors is really the operative idea, right? So you get these policies, define boundaries. Everyone's going to kind of operate better with each other if there are some clearly defined boundaries at work. Boundaries. And in this experiment, how it was set up is there was a number of people in a room at computers, and they were being given a test, like kind of like a math test. Not too hard, but a math test that had some pretty clear right and wrong answers. And the idea was there was a prize for doing well on the test. And unbeknownst to the people taking the test, the experimenters had set it up in such a way that it was possible for people to cheat. So meaning the people taking the test could figure out, oh, wait, I could cheat on this if I wanted to. But they thought maybe it was just an error, or something like this that the experimenters didn't catch. And so what the experimenters were really interested in doing was changing the conditions in the room to see if the environment impacted whether or not people cheated. So they decided to let's dim the lights and see if people cheat more or less. So they dim the lights, and it turns out people cheat more when the lights were down. And they said, well, what if we changed another condition? What if we painted big cartoon eyes on the wall? Would people cheat more or less? Turns out they cheat less when there are big cartoon eyes painted on the wall. And why is this important? Well, it turns out that people will cheat more or more prone to cheating when they feel that their actions are going to be unknown to people and their reputations are not on the line. In other words, that they're not being watched. So when the lights were down, people just kind of felt like they were kind of more incognito, and so were more likely to cheat. Lights turned up and eyes were painted on the wall. They just felt like they were being watched, and therefore their reputations were on the line, and their actions were transparent. So therefore, they weren't like the that for local government better but that we can idea of people being more likely to stay within the rules if they feel their actions are transparent and their reputation is on the line. So we're going to use a little case study from the city of Tempe to illustrate that. So the city of Tempe is in Arizona, and they have a little presentation format they call the Golden Cone of Prosperity, or Prosperity, I should say. And what this presentation shows is they have a fund balance, and this is back in 2009. You may notice, and why I like this example is they still use this today. So they started this back in 2009, so it shows that it has staying power. But anyways, how this presentation is set up is they have a fund balance equal to 25%, and they want to know if their projected fund balance 5 years in the future stays within this range that they have set up. And kind of the backstory here is that back in 2009, they had a fund balance policy that said their fund balance should be equal to 25% of their revenues. However, that they had some arguments in Tempe because the fund balance was actually at 32%. And the question was, well, our policy says 25, we have 32, is that good because we have more, or is it bad because we have too much? And so there were different opinions, arguments. So what they do is, what, we're with a amount of, and we're going to change 20%. If that's a range that everyone could live with, so the people that thought 31 was too much, brought the range down below 30, and then also the potential that could go as low as 20, and it would be fine. Other people that thought, a larger amount was fine too, they still had this higher amount of, say, between 25 and 30 also being acceptable. So this is the range they're able to arrive at through compromise and consensus. And then they agreed, well, over this 5-year period, we would bring the fund balance down into the range by spending money on one-time projects, like maybe reducing our debt or maybe a capital project, what have you. But the point being, over this multi-year period, they can see that their actions are causing the reserve to remain within their agreed-upon range. So if you think about this range as their boundary and the golden cone of prosperity as a way of making the city's actions transparent and their reputation on the line, it works, right? Because their reputation is, are we going to remain within our fund balance policy? It is pretty obvious from this presentation whether they're going to do it or whether they're not going to do it. So it kind of accomplishes a lot of purposes for the city of Tempe. And as I mentioned, the fact that they still use the same presentation today speaks to its staying power. So let's move on then. So that's for the kind of big picture in Tempe and their general fund reserve. But let's kind of go down to some of the micro sort of concerns. So if that was the big picture, let's get below the big picture and into some of the details. So we might think about the budgeting process. So you have an incremental budget process in Tempe, and many local governments have one. And basically what that just means is you take last year's budget and then change it around the margins depending on whether you expect more revenue or less revenue. So if you expect, say, 3% revenue growth, you may give everyone a 3% budget increase. So now the problem with the incremental budget is that it gives departments an incentive to try to build things into their base budget and insulate themselves from future competition. So just for example, I'm sure you may have heard of this, is that a department might come up with a one-time project. They say, well, this is a project that we want to do just this year, so we need to increase our budget by this amount for just this year. So they get that in their budget. And then the next year comes along, and it was in their budget, and it just kind of gets moved forward into the base budget for next year, and the department's not really saying anything. They're not saying, oh, wait, this is supposed to be 1 year only. It's supposed to, it was originally sold as a one-time expenditure, and it just kind of makes its way into the base, and then because it's an incremental budget, you just start with last year's budget and change around the margins. It's now been, that money has gotten built into their base. They've essentially captured it and insulated themselves from future competition. You can see if our tragedy of the commons problem that we talked about at the beginning of this presentation really is relevant in that particular example. So what do they do in Tempe? Well, in Tempe, they have something called supplementals. So they have a base budget, which is the same amount from year to year. But if you want any additional funding whatsoever, you have to ask for what is called a supplemental. And what they do is they take all these supplementals and they're reviewed by the entire city management team, which includes the city manager plus all the department heads. And they then rate these different supplementals using a set of criteria. And those criteria are linked to the city's strategic plan. For example, will this particular supplemental expenditure request contribute to one of the city's strategic priorities, or another criteria is, will it reduce the city's long-term costs, things like this. So they all rate the supplementals together based on these criteria, and then they agree as a group which supplementals they're going to go forward with. And why is this important to our discussion about monitoring? As you think about it, it's a very transparent way decide who gets what, right? So there are no questions about, oh, did the police department just get things because they're the police, or did this person get something because city manager likes them better? No, everyone was working together to rate these different supplementals. We all saw the criteria that were used to rate them, and then we all agreed at the end of the day which ones we were going to fund and which ones we are not going to fund. And again, if departments are trying to, it's very difficult to play budget games like the one we just described earlier, because everyone's seeing what all is being added to, what type of resource is being added to each budget. Okay, so let's move on to the next portion here, was budget controls in Tempe. So in Tempe, each budget has two parts, the personnel budget and everything else. So they've got a lot of flexibility as a department to move funding between line items in the everything else category. And what Tempe has is their ERP system automates the controls to prevent money being moved between the personnel budget and the everything else budget. So departments then have to respect this boundary because the system just won't let them move money in between those two boundaries. So you're going to automate a lot of these boundaries as well, which I think is something to think about as you're setting up your systems. And then lastly, we'll cover monitoring during the year. And the idea being with this is that it's one thing to say have a system that won't let you overspend your personnel budget for the entire year, or even your everything else budget for that matter, for the entire year. But what if you say spend 75% of your budget in the first quarter? That does not bode well, right, for the rest of the year. So Tempe has this in-year monitoring system where they look at trends of how budgets are typically spent, and then how actual spending or revenues, for that matter, is occurring relative to that budget. So if you were, say, a department that spent more or less the same amount spent evenly during the year, you might be expected to have spent 25% of your budget at the end of the first quarter. If that department had spent 50 or 33% of their budget at the end of the first quarter, that would probably get them a negative. So they would have a red negative in this little dashboard that Tempe has. They also look at revenues in the same way. So, for example, sales tax or property tax come in different patterns. So, for instance, if they notice that their holiday shopping sales taxes are a lot less than they might expect, they can highlight that in their dashboard and kind of make sure they're revising their expectations downward for the rest of the year. So it's a good way to kind of stay on top of the direction during the year so that they're not caught flat-footed at the end of the year. All right, well, we're going to move forward from here to budget reporting. And Scott, you're going to say a little bit about this.
I am. This first slide here is actually part of a financial policies course that I've taught for GFOA a couple of times. And what we're essentially looking at here is ideally a municipality's financial policies will include in one of its adopted policies, a reporting policy, a formal policy that includes, when you will report or monitor the budget, to whom you will report, and how often you will report it, and where you report it. So with all these criteria, it really formalizes that process. Again, keeps both the policymakers and management engaged. And I think on the next couple of slides, Shane, if you can advance it, it gives an example of Kansas City's specific policy. And in Kansas City, we report every quarter. And we had done this informally for several years, but prior to probably about 2014, it wasn't always consistent and rigorous in reporting and monitoring every quarter. So a formal policy came out during a minor controversy with the previous council when some finance staff was accused of not adequately monitoring and following ordinances properly. So we developed what was really our existing process more formally, and it's actually made our reporting and monitoring much stronger by having it, in our case, in the city code. So the first part obviously just says that the Office of Management and Budget and the Finance Department will report quarterly to the City Council. And on the next slide, it describes a little bit more on the types of things that we are required to report each quarter. So it says, of course, that we have to report any line item anomalies, any unusual occurrences, and especially items that could affect fund balance as we project for the remainder of the year. This isn't everything we report on. Our reports are actually, multi-pages, have lots of schedules, charts, numbers, et cetera, but these are the items that we're required to report on. And again, it keeps all stakeholders, elected and appointed, engaged in the budget process throughout the year, and like everything else we're trying to do, it just helps to reduce the surprises along the way as it relates to both finances and operations.
All right, very good. All right, Scott, appreciate that. Okay, so we're going to kind of move on here to next phase of the Pillar 4. And I'm going to just revisit this experiment that I know we had some sound problems, so maybe you're like, oh, I'm hearing this for the first time. So in this particular experiment, it's called the public goods game, and the idea was that you've got folks who are contributing to a common pool on the left-hand side. So the experimenter gives them amount of money. On the folks on the left-hand side then have the option to contribute this money to a common pool, much like taxpayers might contribute to a local government. And the experimenter multiplies out the contribution and divides it evenly among the participants. So let's say I give $500 in taxes, and that's going to fire protection. Presumably, that fire protection service is worth more to me than $500. So even though I don't get, say, more fire protection services than someone that paid $100 in taxes, we're still all happy because fire protection is worth more to us than we paid. So under this system, people will continue to contribute to the common pool over multiple rounds, meaning the experiment says, all right, let's play the game again. They'll keep contributing. So you could vary the conditions of this game, though, and one of the variations might be someone holds out. So someone here realizes, if I don't pay my taxes, I could still get the service, right? Because people don't check the tax records before the fire trucks goes out to see if you've paid your taxes or not. So in this case, everyone gives money, or except one guy, and the experimenter multiplies the contribution, and the person who did not contribute is going to come out ahead because they gave nothing and still got money, where the other people, they're going to see their return drop and are going to be less happy. And again, the same thing happens in a local government situation where if someone is benefiting from this, the other people are going to see that and they're going to be displeased, and they're going to probably either reduce their contributions in the future or stop contributing altogether. So how is this relevant? So kind of you might think about like in a local government situation, right? If you've got a number of departments that are contributing their best efforts to balance the budget, and you've got one department that says, well, everyone else is like doing good at cutting the fat or whatever, kind of leaning their department. I'm not going to try so hard because if everyone else is trying, the total budget will be fine. Everyone sees this other person of the department be able to get away with that or to continue to pad their budget. They're probably not going to be happy participants in the budget process. So having everyone participate equally and fairly, pretty key. So let's move on to think about how we might kind of enforce then people participating fairly and equally in these types of systems. So one good way to go about this is budget authority to reward those who cooperate. So for example, in the city or county of San Bernardino, they had that strategic vision. So the CEO there really linked the budget allocations departments got to their willingness to support the strategic plan. So if a department comes forward with a budget proposal that is not in alignment with what the strategic plan is trying to accomplish, then they would not get their budget. The department comes forward with a budget request that is very much in alignment with what the strategic plan is trying to do, CEO is going to support that budget request. So a pretty simple way to get the power of the purse strings working for you there. So let's move on to maybe some other ways. This is, you might have to go and think about some penalties because that was more of a reward system that we just looked at. What about a penalty system? So the idea here is you might want to start with lighter touch penalties because the kind of heavy touch penalty, if you will, would be to fire someone. But, that's kind of a ramping up the severity quite a bit and might be fairly difficult. So in Minneapolis, they went for a lighter touch approach, and in their particular experience, what happened was they had a number of departments that would consistently go over budget. And if you go back to our experimental game we just showed from the slide with the experimenter, you think about that. If you've got a number of departments that are consistently going over their budget, what does that say to the other departments who haven't yet gone over their budget? Well, maybe I should pay less attention to my budget if I go over too. No big deal, because that's just kind of what everyone else is doing. So it's a problem that could really kind of multiply and spread, if not really dealt with. So in Minneapolis, they decided to first attempt to deal with this problem is we were going to put budget analysts in every department, and those budget analysts will cajole the departments into following their budget. So you might guess that the departments ignored the budget analysts, like, we don't really care what the budget analyst has to say. We're going to continue to overspend our budget anyhow. So the budget office in Minneapolis realized it's not working, so they pulled the budget analysts out, and they said, all right, no problem, you guys manage your own budget, meaning the departments. What you guys are going to do, departments, is that if you go over budget, you have to come to the City Ways and Means Committee meeting, which is on television, by the way, and explain at this meeting why you're over budget, what you're going to do to fix it, and then come back the next 2 months to explain to the Ways and Means Committee how you're doing on fixing that, again, on television. So maybe you could guess that the departments were suddenly, hey, you know what, I'm going to follow my budget because I don't want to be in front of the Ways and Means Committee on television explaining why I can't manage my department properly. So budget compliance went way up. And this is a few years ago, and today, just catching up with the CFO, they don't even have that policy anymore because it's now become the way things are done in Minneapolis is people just follow their budget because that's how it is. So he said, yeah, we could re-implement that policy if we needed to, but we don't even really need it at this point. So that policy kind of created a new way of behavior in the city of Minneapolis, but it took a little lighter touch penalty to get there. All right, let's move on to removing barriers to doing the right thing. So the idea here is that a lot of times the way systems are set up in local government actually encourage the wrong behavior. A good example there is use it or lose it budgeting. So the idea being, if you're not familiar with that term, is that if the appropriation lapses at the end of the year, the incentive might be to spend out that appropriation. And so if we remember our friend, the San Bernardino sheriff, he was very familiar with this tactic where the end of the budget year would be coming up. So he's, all right, and we haven't spent a few of our line items, let's start buying things that maybe were not really necessary, so it was really not a great use of the county's resources. And the sheriff kind of knew this, so the sheriff wasn't like, wow, I'm amazing at budgeting. The sheriff was like, well, this is how the budget game is played, and if I want to provide good police services and public safety services, I've got to play the game. So he went and did this. And so the CEO said, right, well, what if we had a better alternative? We know that San Bernardino is a big landmass, size of Massachusetts, very large county. You have helicopters that you need to fly around to conduct the sheriff's business. 5 of those helicopters are reaching the end of their useful life. It's going to be very expensive to replace those helicopters, and it's going to put some strain on the sheriff's budget. What if we create a sinking fund where you could put your surpluses in that sinking fund so that when the time came to replace the helicopters, you're good to go. The helicopters are funded. And guess what? The sheriff immediately and enthusiastically started producing actual budget surpluses. So those things at the end of the year you used to buy? It turns out we don't really need those. So we're going to fund that helicopter replacement sinking fund instead. So that was a good kind of move for both the county and the sheriff, win-win. Because you can imagine if the sheriff had been spending their budget out every single year, and then it comes to helicopter replacement year, sheriff is going to show up and say, you know what, I need extra budget this year beyond what I normally get in order to fund these helicopters, and you'd have a big draw on the county's financial capacity, but instead of those helicopters already funded. All right, let's move on to our next slide here, which is another barrier. And this barrier was exaggerating legal restrictions on funds in an attempt by departments to fund what they think is important. So in other words, hey, this grant that we get, it's got to be spent on drug sniffing dogs, and that's the only thing to be spent on. Things like this, right? And the idea being is the departments are trying to fund their service, so they kind of exaggerate these restrictions so that the funds don't get repurposed for something else. And kind of, again, the sheriff kind of knew how this worked and had developed these sorts of exaggerated restrictions on some of their funds. And where the CEO recognized and said, again, all right, Sheriff, we kind of know what's going on here. We don't want to take those funds away from you. Let's just work together to find a better purpose that serves everybody. So what they had noticed in the Sheriff's Department is that they had a large accrued leave liability, and what the practical impact of this was that when a deputy would separate from the sheriff office, whether it's retirement or whatever else, they would have to pay out this accrued leave. And then because they had just paid this out, they would have to hold the position vacant for a number of months to make up the amount of money they just paid out in accrued leave, because they didn't have an accrued leave reserve ready to offset that. So the kind of suggestion the CEO made is, hey, well, what if we kind of freed up some of these funds by kind of recognizing the exaggerated legal restrictions, and instead developed a accrued leave liability reserve that you can then start to put some of these extra funds towards, so you don't have to have sheriff positions vacant and therefore less officers on the street. Instead, you'll be able to pay out that leave and then rehire someone right away. So the sheriff thought that was a great idea, went along with it. So again, worked out quite well, because you've got more sheriffs on the street in San Bernardino, the amount of sheriffs that they want to have, and also kind of making sure that amount of leave liability that was building up is properly managed. So with that, let's move on to the next slide here. And that would be a little question. So if you remember the golden cone of prosperity in Tempe, that was the little graphic where they forecasted whether or not their fund balance was going to be within the range of general fund reserves that their policy called for over a 5-year period. And that is the golden cone of prosperity. And we want to know if you have an equivalent of a golden cone of prosperity in your local government that is an easily understood indicator of whether or not you're on a financially sustainable path, or if that's something you lack. So we'll give everyone a minute here to think about that. All right, so I think everyone's probably had their chance. Now we're going to move forward here in the interest of time. And we're going to go to our last pillar here, which is treating everybody fairly. Okay, so the one more little experiment I want to share with you guys as to why fairness matters, and this one is called the ultimatum game. And how the ultimatum game works is that, imagine Scott and I are playing the ultimatum game. I get $10. I can distribute that $10 to Scott any way I want. I can give Scott $1. I can give him $9. The only thing Scott can do is he can either accept what I offer, or he can veto the entire thing so that nobody gets anything. So we both get 0 essentially. And so the rational thing for Scott to do would, if I give him $1, would be to accept that dollar, because that is $1 more than he had when he started the game. However, when you play this game with real people, they often reject offers $3 and less, because the idea being is, hey, you just got 10 free dollars and you're just going to give me 3. That feels unfair. I would rather punish you by just blowing up the entire thing so that no one gets anything, rather than to accept $3 and see you keep 7. So you can imagine then that the same concept can apply to lots of different things in our political lives, where people feel that unfairness is being perpetrated against them. They might be willing to sabotage or destroy the entire system, even if it hurts themselves, in order to punish the people that they perceive are treating them unfairly. So that means it's pretty important in our local government context to also kind of be mindful of the role of fair treatment in our finances. So let's move on to see a little bit about how that can be done. So the first concept here is this idea of procedural justice. So there's been some good research that shows if you meet these 4 criteria in the decision-making process, you have a very good chance of that process being perceived as fair. And the kind of what's pretty neat about this is the research has shown that when people perceive a system or decision process as fair, that they're willing to go along with decisions that come out of that process, even if those decisions aren't necessarily their preferred outcome. So just to give you an example, they did a study with folks who were the victims of layoffs, and they found that folks who perceived the layoff decision as unfair were 60% likely to launch a lawsuit against their former employer, whereas people that perceived the layoff system as fair were only 16% likely to launch a lawsuit against their former employer. And there's a lot of different research like this where they compare the sense of fairness that people felt from the decision-making process, and then their attitudes about the process is pretty consistent, that when people see the system as fair, they're more likely to accept decisions that aren't necessarily in their self-interest. So we're going to go through these 4 criteria here and talk about which each of these mean a little bit. All right, so the first one is decisions are based on accurate information. So the idea of being here is you need to take time to find the facts and to find a problem. We talked about Hampton's tax experience earlier on, where the idea was that Hampton did a little examination of property taxes in the region because some folks felt that Hampton's taxes were too high, and so Hampton did the study of surrounding cities to find out what their tax rates were, and also help people understand what went into the monthly bill that they get, which included for many folks not just taxes, but also mortgage principal, mortgage interest, maybe mortgage insurance, things like this that kind of perhaps when you look at the whole bill might have obscured how much of that was actually Hampton's taxes. And then another example here is comes from a school district that was doing some salary negotiations with their teachers, and they were coming up with comparables for the negotiations, and the district office had picked districts that were financially comparable in terms of financial capacity, and the district, or the teachers, I should say, had picked districts that were nearby, so geographically proximate. And the teacher's rationale was, well, if I was working in this district and I live in the district, I would probably go work in some other nearby district. Even though some of those districts maybe had greater financial capacity, that wasn't what the teachers were really looking at. They're just looking at, like, hey, realistically, where else would I work? And these two perspectives, financial capacity versus geographically proximate, each have some validity. So the teachers would have felt like, hey, if you're just looking at like some district that's on the other side of the state that happens to have a similar financial capacity, doesn't feel like it's a fair comparable. So the two sides had to think about how they could combine their perspectives to come up with a shared set of comparables that both felt made sense. And that contributed to the idea of being kind of just basing a decision on accurate information as a first step towards achieving a fair decision. Number 2 is the using fair decision-making criteria. The criteria is a decision is based on criteria that people feel is fair. And to cover that, I'm going to look at or examine Traverse City Area Public Schools with you. And they're in Michigan. And Michigan has been facing some tough economic times recently, and Traverse City Area Public Schools has been part of that. So they've had declining enrollment, declining revenue, aging facilities, and all that really added up to difficult decisions, including the need to consider closing 2 school buildings in Traverse City Area Public Schools. This is not a gigantic district, so 2 school buildings is a lot. They were underutilized because of the declining enrollment and that sort of thing. So they had to think about, should we close these buildings or should we not close these buildings? So one of the things they did was they established some decision-making principles, and they had 3 of them. Number 1 was educational priorities should drive the budget. Number 2 was you can't be all things to all people. And number 3 was you need to get the most bang for the buck. And so what they did is they compared the school district or school building closing to these 3 criteria. So number 1 was educational priorities should drive the budget. So if we want to provide the best educational service to children, should we fund the things we've always funded? Yes, we've funded these buildings in the past, but does that mean we should fund them going forward? So necessarily, not necessarily, because we need to think about what our educational priorities are. Number 2 was you can't be all things to all people. Yes, it's true that the students and families that go to these 2 school buildings are not going to love the decision to close the building, but we can't be all things to all people, right? So that implies that maybe it's something we should consider closing these buildings. And lastly is getting the most bang for the buck. We have to compare the money that we'd spend on the overhead for these underutilized school buildings versus some of the educational needs we have. So, for example, Traverse City Area Public Schools was below the state average for math scores. They need to improve their math curriculum. So would we get more bang for the buck by keeping open these underattended schools or by investing in new math curriculum? Probably by investing in your math curriculum. So they made the decision to close those 2 school buildings. And what was really interesting about that is that the decision was supported by both the Teachers Union and the Chamber of Commerce, so 2 organizations that don't often agree on much in Traverse City Area Public Schools. And then even more importantly, 97%, I believe it was, of the students that were at those 2 schools elected to continue their education with Traverse City Area Public Schools at other school buildings. So they understood that, yes, I don't love this decision, but I understand that it was based on principles and criteria that make sense. All right, moving on to our next criteria is all affected stakeholders have opportunity for input. So I think we saw a lot of examples of that in our presentation here today. Scott gave a number of examples of that with the Circle of Life. You may have heard the Hampton example, some of that. But the point being of this slide, there's lots of ways for people to give input. So it doesn't necessarily mean they are making the decision. It could be collective decision making, but there are other things too, like maybe they just have the opportunity to articulate their interests or their case. They may provide input into what the options might be, but someone else is deciding, or maybe they help define the decision-making criteria. So lots of ways people could have input, but just the point being here is giving the opportunity for input in some way is going to contribute to perceived fairness in decision-making. And then the last point here we want to make about procedural justice is that mistakes are recognized and corrected. So the kind of idea being here is that it's good to acknowledge that decisions may not work out as you planned, and then thinking about how you might correct decisions if they aren't going the way you thought they would. And one good way to do that is pilot projects. So just returning to Traverse City Area Public Schools, they did decide to invest that money in a math curriculum. However, there was some controversy over replacing the math curriculum. In fact, when they had tried to do that a few years prior, there was a headline in the local paper called Math Wars. So in other words, controversial. So what they did was they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to do a pilot of 3 new curriculum plus the old one at different buildings within Traverse City Public Schools, and then we're going to see which one works best. So that was very pleasing and to a lot of people because it wasn't like, well, we decided which curriculum we're going to pick in a back room somewhere and now everyone just has to live with it. We're going to give each of the curriculum a chance and we're just going to see which one wins by its merits. And so that was very popular. People got behind this, very excited. They even had kids chanting, "We love math" in some of the schools because of the excitement built by the new curriculum, which wasn't happening in the old curriculum. So that was a good clue that new curriculum might be a good thing. But anyway, so it worked out very well in that case to use a pilot project because it wasn't seen as kind of, hey, this is the way it's going and it doesn't matter whether or not the curriculum is the best one because we're going with it. Instead, we're going to find out together which one is going to be the best curriculum for Traverse City Public Schools. So with that, we've got one more question here for you. If we're thinking about the features of procedural justice, which of these have you really nailed down in your budgeting process? And we had those 4 components to procedural justice. So, and those included, I believe I can move the slide back for you just so you can review those while you look at the poll. Let me do that for you real quick so you can see those. There are your 4 criteria. Decisions are based on accurate information, transparent and consistent decision-making criteria applied equally. Stakeholders given opportunity for input, and mistakes are recognized and corrected. So go ahead and let us know what you think in terms of how many of those you've really kind of nailed down in your own budget process. I'll give you a minute there to consider. All right, very good. All right, cool. Let's move on to the conclusion of the webinar. All right, so just to summarize here is this framework, the Financial Foundations framework is not so much a revolution. It's kind of, you've probably noticed that there's a lot of concepts that maybe you've heard before, and so we're kind of taking a lot of stuff that is new, some stuff that's new, plus stuff that is been part of the GFOA community's practice over the last number of years and kind of merging them together into kind of a codified approach to having a solid financial framework and foundation for your community. So let's kind of then move on to our conclusion here. As far as what's next, we have a website that gets into a little more detail about the framework. So that is at www.gfoa.org/financial foundations, and we can send that to you in an email. We're coming out with a book. So the good news of the book is it's not an audio book, so there won't be any audio glitches in it. It's something you read, so that's certainly a positive. We're also thinking about how you can connect with other people who are interested in this concept, so you have the ability to kind of join up in a club and also kind of interact with other folks who are interested in this. And, why would you want to do this? Is number one, ensure a thriving community for your where you work. So in other words, if you've got a strong financial foundation, you're going to have the possibility of having better health, safety, and welfare for community as well. We saw that, for example, with the San Bernardino County, Traverse City Area Public Schools. All these folks realize better public service outcomes as a result of having a more solid financial foundation. Being more resilient against unexpected impacts or unexpected events. So if you have these foundations, these pillars in place, you'll better be able to withstand shocks and stresses. And then personally become a leader in public finance. So a lot of the folks in the local governments that we profiled in this presentation have really become leaders in their states and even nationally because they've gotten a lot of attention for some of the good stuff that they've done. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. I also want to apologize for the earlier audio miscues or glitches, I guess is the better word for it. So do apologize for that. But the good news is there will be a lot of opportunities to learn more about these concepts through the book or the website, other mediums that we have. So we'll be in touch to keep you apprised of all of that. So with that, we're about out of time. So unless there are any questions, which Adam, if you are able to moderate the question period. If we don't have any, since we're out of time, we can conclude the webinar. Adam, do we have any questions, or are we done?
If anyone has any further questions, they can go ahead and type them into the Q&A panel in the event management system. Looks like someone wants to know when the book is coming out.
End of the summer.
Looks like there aren't any more questions at this point.
All right.
Well, this is Scott. Very quickly, Shane, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. And I'm really excited to hear more and participate throughout this process. And when the book comes out, I'll definitely be getting that. So thanks again, Shane.
Oh, thank you, Scott, for participating here and sharing your experience, everybody. All right, everyone, have a great day and good weekend, and we'll be in touch.